It's wonderful to be here. As a matter of fact, 30 years ago, I was in a laboratory at CUNY calibrating pumps, and here I am giving a talk. So it's been a wonderful 30 years. I remember when the ERC was founded and these meetings were founded, so I feel honored to be invited to give this talk on one of my favorite topics and my favorite chemicals. The second one is asbestos, from an environmental sort of use material. The history of lead is just overwhelming. It's an amazing material, and I'm going to break this part into a combination of why was it used, as well as some of the chronology of the main events, leading off, ending up with the sort of the future of what we're doing with lead and lead banning of lead materials and toys, and will it ever even get banned. So let me begin. 30 minutes I think I have. We'll see how far we can go, whether we can even shorten that a little for everybody. The background of this is just a historical representation of some of the uses of lead and the different parts in history there. So you could just look at that in your spare time. So I need to, being a professor, I need to at least give you some background on what this material is really all about. You're going to hear me a lot rave about lead, and I could actually rave about asbestos. Asbestos is an amazing material. The fact that it was used so heavily is proof that it was really something that the industry just did not want to let go of. And lead has many similar features. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of these amazing properties. A lot of this is in my office. Some of you that have been to my office know I'm a collector of environmental artifacts. And I don't want to tell you everything that's in my office because the EPA would probably immediately seize it. But by all means, come to Hunter and I'll give you a very interesting tour of some of this material. Pigments. Lead is a metallic pigment. It does not oxidize. So we've seen it in this yellow here in the National Geographic, as well as the plates, the color plates in old 1920s, 1930s National Geographics. Have lead as a pigment. We have an XRF. We've tested this over and over. Of course, if you burn this magazine, which is an interesting issue in maybe recycling old magazines like that, including Time magazine, Life magazine, you would actually get some release of not just lead, but other metallic pigments. The glass on the left is a very famous piece of history. It's the McDonald's glass, the Ronald McDonald with lead paint on it. That was banned by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It was recalled. And that yellow there is actually detectable amounts of lead on an XRF, which is fairly high. It's in the 10 milligrams per square centimeter range. Pottery, pigments. Let me just give you a quick refresher on pottery. The clay could have lead. The colorant can have lead, and the glaze can have lead. So it's really a triple whammy. And there are cases where all three have leaded materials. But most of the time it's the glaze, at least in Mexican pottery, it's the glaze that is the bad guy. And even today they're still using lead glaze in Mexico. Little soldiers here, just the color plates. But a lot of my work was quantifying lead deposition in urban environments and where it's coming from. Yes, this is not only lead paint up here, but the yellow lines that you see do have lead pigments. That's why you'll see the lack of yellow lines on your way home. Look for yellow lines. You'll see they're moving away from yellow because of a voluntary ban on yellow fluorescent pigments, and this is actually almost a paste. It's rather thick. So they're moving to fluorescent white lines. The material is amazingly strong. Of course, you know what this is, but you may not have known that these columns were held together using molten lead rods, which later were sort of ripped apart and recycled. People wanted those leads. Certain cultures to the east of Greece, which I shall not mention, sort of raped the country and took away all our lead. But the smart Greeks put steel rods in these, which subsequently rusted and cracked the beams. So now there's a major restoration to remove what the Greeks tried to fix after the Turks stole the lead. So it's a crazy world out there. But actually, if you go to Florence and Venice, you'll actually see columns and blocks of marble held together with lead pins in a dovetail shape. Very interesting. I didn't put the slide there. The aqueducts were lined with lead. There's caulking that was used to prevent leakage. This is a modern-day dome in Jerusalem, in the old city, made of leaded materials. And actually, down the block from Hunter, there was a restoration of a bathhouse, the Asher Levy bathhouse, which has lead flashing used on the side because it required restoring the material to its original, restoring the building to its original status for historic preservation. So they actually used lead flashing, which is sort of interesting. The weight, of course, you see this all over, everything from wheel weights, which I'm happy to say are now being phased out. The industry fought this hard. These wheel weights do fly off. They're pure lead. Do fly off, eventually oxidize, and contribute to roadside lead loadings. Everything from sinkers, which are still abundant at Effingers and Home Depot and all these large recreation stores. This is, of course, a ship, a cruise ship, and you sort of wonder, boy, it's pretty shallow when you consider the height from here, the waterline, to here, right? And look how shallow it is. This is a new design, primarily because this huge bulbous is pure lead. This is actually used to keep ballast for the boats, so a sort of a balancing act, as well as the keels for sailboats, but those are very deep. And of course, in New York City, every crane has leaded plates. They're painted different colors, so you don't really see them. Shield, and the materials are wonderful because of its high density. It's a wonderful shielder. So you see, and of course, a very famous picture here, the antenna up here. This is the part of the antenna that was collapsed. We know, and there are colleagues in this room that have measured exposures at ground zero, and there was lead. There was lead in the air. There was lead in the pores, in the spaces. Where did that come from? The suspicion is primarily the lead shielding around the antenna, which you see up on the top left of that material, as well as common uses in medicine. So lead is really not going to go anywhere in that case. A good deal of my work today is really U-Labs, used lead acid battery, recycling, and sort of risk assessment for communities that are not doing this properly. And these are some sad pictures. I have boxes of photographs and slides on all these used lead acid battery facilities worldwide. But basically, a battery is essentially three things: plastic, lead, and acid. All of them are completely recycled and are recycled. And unfortunately, it's very easy to break this battery open, throw this into a pot, and melt a handful of lead to buy rice. So it is very sad what's going on. That's not going to go away. And just to clarify, the new batteries, the hybrid cards, do not use lead as one of the elements of that. Solder is, of course, very common. Food. Well, we all hear about lead in different food products. Let me just set the record straight. Lead is, when reacted with acetic acid, in this reaction, is lead acetate is sweet. And it was added, to the surprise of many, in various pewter products. They would add wine. All of a sudden, the wine would last longer, and it would taste better. So this whole concept in the Roman empires of storing lead in that flask. And of course, who had lead flasks? The very wealthy in the the aristocratic portion of the population, including the Roman Senate. So some of what Gilfillan mentioned in 1965 about the fall of the Roman Empire is sort of linked into the use of lead containers. But as far as chapulines and tamarindo candies, most of the lead that we see in these products from Mexico are for colorants. Lead is a very, very inexpensive red pigment, lead chromate. It's dirt cheap, easy to make. Every single organic form of a red colorant is extremely expensive, orders of magnitude more. So when they have the chance to use this, they often do. And they'll actually sprinkle the grasshoppers with a lead coating, some water, just to get some color into them, because people like red candy, right? And you also like red candy. But red, we all know in environmental science, is the most deadly pigment. There's no almost well, I don't want to say there's no such thing as a safe red colorant, but if you look at the history of environmental contaminants, red has always been a problem. Some quick history on the metallurgical side of things. Lead is a natural. It's one of the original 7 metals of antiquity. Those are the rest of them up there. The 2 that are underlined are ones that have to be smelted or at least extracted through some type of heat process. And what you see on the right is galena, lead sulfide, which is abundant, especially in Galena, Missouri, where you have major lead mining many years ago. As a matter of fact, the town was named Galena for its lead. There's 2-step process of roasting, which of course releases sulfur dioxide, and then the next step of converting lead oxide by combining it with coal to produce the metallic lead. So different populations trying to recover lead products will do whatever they can. Many, in the case of batteries, they'll just melt battery plates and hope that they'll get 20% molten lead. And then the rest of it is lead oxide, which is very nasty. Most of us know that this fine powder is a source of most of the toxicity that we see. Well, let's start a little history. You have a handout on that. I'd like you to memorize that. Hunter students, that'll be on your comprehensive exam, all 5 pages of dates. I put that together years ago for some litigation, and it was quite interesting. It's not complete. There are many important dates that are missing there, especially the epidemiological events of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But you can really appreciate this. I didn't want to give you just a complete chronology, so I'll sort of do it this way. But the material has been used in just about every part of the body, every cure that people thought. When you sort of investigate this, it's just shocking how it was used for everything. Well-known spermicide. In one case, it's a way to conceive. It's another way to stop conception. It's a way to cure intestinal pain. It's a way to cause it. We have everything here. Treatment of ganglion. Applying a thick lead plate on patients for treatment of ganglion. So you see, it really is in these sort of middle ages of sort of experimenting with it. And I'm not a pathologist, but I've always suspected that because of lead's toxicity, it actually may have had some beneficial use as a drug, because many drugs are toxic to particular organs or enzyme pathways. But again, we see a wide range of history, a wide range of effects from colic, diarrhea, to poisonings. But perhaps we can't just let Paracelsus get away with it. We all love this fellow. We all quote him nonstop in every single environmental toxicology class. We know his famous dose makes the poison statement, but he actually did sort of popularize the use of lead in this case, lead for fever in Saturnus. Saturn is a constellation, a star, a planet that's been always linked with lead. So whenever you see lead, you'll see words like Galena, Saturnus, all these other references to the stars. As well as many, many publications where they talked about different lead ointments and concoctions. Moving on to a bit of more modern history, we all have probably heard about Ben Franklin and his famous lead letter. I would have loved to have provided for you. It's actually an amazing document. I must say, I went back and reread the entire document. I encourage you to sort of Google Ben Franklin lead poisoning, and you'll find his letter easily enough. It actually describes his epidemiological, almost a John Snow approach to shoe leather epidemiology, saying, well, I was here and I saw this effect, I was here and I saw that effect, blah, 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 blah. And he concludes at the end that it's my judgment that the colic in these typesetters is likely caused by lead. An amazing piece of writing, and he ends it with something which is true, sort of sadly to say today, right, that you will see by it that the opinion of this mischievous effect from lead is at least above 60 years old. on and on, that a truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced on. And how true this is, almost 150 some odd years ago. Moving into history, if you look at the dates, this is 1786, shortly after the discovery, of course, of the pigment, the desirable effects, the desirable properties of mixing lead with other minerals to get various colors, whether it's a green or a gold or a yellow or a white, was commonly done in paints. Up here, let's see if I could focus your attention, 1837, you could sort of see a palette of pigments, piles of pigments, and paint was made years ago by basically weighing different quantities of these pigments and mixing it with linseed oil and egg yolk and binding it all together. So early pigment manufacturers and painters were actually using powdered materials. And even in this Dutch boy handbook, one of the original recipes for how a painter, and this is why painters were tradespersons of high skill going to apprentice school to learn how to make paints and how many grams or how many ounces of this colorant versus this colorant to get a certain color blue. And this is actually one of their training books on making various colors. This is a famous advertisement which really does implicate that someone in 1837 knew that lead pigments, and by the way, notice I'm moving from materials into paints, which is sort of where we'll go, and of course we'll talk about gasoline also. But this is now 1897, some 60 years later, and their advertising is not made with lead and is non-poisonous. Well, this is some time ago. This is obviously people have made some at least conclusions about that. Yet despite that, it was continuous. It was used in more and more materials. Lead acetate as various ointments, and some of this is is actually used today. I periodically go to Morbidity and Mortality weekly reports and look at sort of what recent lead poisoning instances occur, and there are plenty of them. The Nike. The Reebok heart that was used as an incentive to buy a certain sneaker, they would put this little toy in there, was pure lead. So it's amazing, even today we find cases where ointments are being used somewhere or being brought into the U.S. And being used in different applications. You could read this as well as I can. Yellow dye in cakes and buns. Fairly scary, especially when cost is an issue. And again, we haven't changed from this. We're still using, and I don't want to keep mentioning Central America, but we have the pervasive uses red as red lead oxide, lead chromate as a colorant for a number of foods. Now, let's just quickly move to some epidemiology, and this is the very famous Turner and Gibson. These two fellows, Turner was the pediatrician, Gibson is actually an ophthalmologist, and together, Turner originally encountered a boy with lead poisoning or some paralysis. And for lead to cause paralysis, we're talking of very high levels. These are 100 plus micrograms per deciliter of lead. So these are the chronic exposures. And slowly in Brisbane, Australia, he put together more and more cases, and ultimately in this time period of 1891 to 1908, discovered 262 cases. But what was especially significant for us is the quantification, or at least the identification of the source being lead paint. This is the first lead paint poisoning case. Prior to this, it was workers that, of course, are always the first to be identifying the hazards in every situation, whether it's chromium or lead or silica. But now we see this in the painted film, and lead paint, especially lead chromate, is a whitish material. It was placed on walls and within a short amount of time would effervesce and sort of produce a nice uniform coating, one whereby if you touched it, you actually would get a powdery material on your fingers, and that was the lead chromate. And that was desirable because that actually made for a nice uniform white surface. But it also made for something that's easily picked up and ingested, and they actually were able to measure it. By the way, at this point, we're also getting better with our chemistry, right? You can't measure lead at 50 micrograms per deciliter in 1890. There's just no capacity. So this history also sort of mimics the idea of analytical chemistry getting to the point where we can now actually measure it. And I would say around this period, there's sort of final recognition that lead is more of a toxicant than at least a therapeutic agent. And we see more and more countries slowly reporting cases, and I have them all, or at least a number of them listed in this document here. In 1920s and actually in the teens, Baltimore and Philadelphia, some of the older cities of the East Coast, the Rust Belt of the U.S., discovered some of this poisoning and started, I shouldn't say screening programs, but programs to limit exposure. And then in 1921, the 13 countries of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, came out with a statement. This is also readily available online if you want to look at it, the White Lead Conference. But I always joke because Europe really didn't have much of an investment in lead, and even asbestos. We all sort of joke that, Mitch and I and others have been to Canada, and they say, oh yes, America, that's where asbestos is toxic. And especially New Jersey, coming from living in New Jersey for many years, it goes, oh yes, asbestos is toxic in New Jersey. Well, we have all the bodies. That's where the plants were. That's where the large factory, that's where the production was. So yes, U.S. has not only a lot of asbestos disease, but we have a lot of lead usage. So it was very simple for Spain to ban lead because they had no investment, no vertical integration of industries. Whereas in this country, that the lead mines are owned by the lead manufacturers, just like the asbestos mines were owned by the asbestos manufacturers. So there was this strong desire not to do anything because the whole industry would collapse. So again, 13 countries banned lead-based paint. And let me just warn you on this word banning. It is, it's not a good word. We don't like this word because is it a regulatory ban? Is it a consumer ban? Is it a industry ban? Is it just a organizational ban saying we strongly recommend you not using this? So has lead been banned? No. In certain materials, yes. In others, no. So when you see something like this, 13 countries ban lead-based paint, it's usually a very narrow, also followed by regulatory limits on how much lead is in the paint. So it's never down to zero. Another interesting piece of history, depression disease, 1930s to 50s, and actually there's some of this going on now. Because, let me just finish this thought. There was no plastic in 1930, right? So when you had car batteries, where were they put in? Well, they were put in wooden boxes. And when the battery got expended, what would you do with the boxes? Well, you would recycle them. You would burn them as fuel in homes. And you can only imagine how much lead was released in that process. And there are many, many instances of poisonings. The tetraethyl lead story is fascinating. We could do a whole 2 hours on just on this. Tetraethyl lead is an ingredient in fuel, and this was when engines were really not that well designed, and the pistons would knock. This is the piston would knock on the side of the cylinder wall, so it would sort of bounce back and forth. Today the engineering is better. Lead causes a uniform combustion so that you get a nice uniform force pushing down on the piston, and it would be what they call anti-knock. Keep in mind, lead does not get destroyed. What comes in goes out. So when you add 4 grams per gallon, and your car back then went 10 miles a gallon, at 10 miles, you would have dumped 4 grams, 4,000 milligrams into the air. So the discovery of this was wonderful in that it was sort of a solution for some of these engine problems. But shortly after, because of its high toxicity, the tetraethyl lead caused many fatalities. So you have a case where this material actually was brought online, and almost immediately people were dying. And who? Workers. And keep in mind the occupational health climate at ESO ESO and Ethel, right. No, Ethel is the name of the company. What happened is Ethel merged with, oh, now I'm blanking out. Is it? Wait, do I have it in my slide? Previous slide. Oh, there it goes. Oh, GM. Oh, how, Frank, I'm sorry. Yeah. Frank, you should have called me. GM and ESO united, and when they discovered, the GM scientists discovered tetraethyl lead, they created a new company, Ethyl Gasoline Corp., which was then the marketer of that project.
Well, at that time, DuPont owned GM, so.
Yeah, that's and there's if you want to read on this, you must read Rosner's book on deceit and denial. It's got some fascinating historical implications there. You actually can go to many stores now and buy octane boosters, and some of those octane boosters have lead. But by and large, most of the octane boosters you get in Pet Boys do not have lead in them. What was interesting with tetraethyl lead is that the industry, the Surgeon General immediately set up a panel. Alice Hamilton, our favorite occupational doc, was on that panel, but they were given 7 months to answer this question. Can you imagine 7 months to design a study to answer the question, is tetraethyl lead toxic to the point where we need to ban it? Bottom line is, it's shortly after it was approved for use, and there was a big campaign, Ethyl is back. So when you see this ad, Ethyl is back, that was in 1926, 27, when they decided to bring it back for gasoline. And from that point on, we'll get into the EPA history in a second, it was used consistently. In the 60s, we have many regulations with paints. Now we're getting into cities, moving into the environmental awareness periods of poisons. And these are some of the interesting dates of mass screening. Baltimore is generally considered the leader in this, and the other big cities following. But notice that when New York prohibits the use of lead-based paint, all they did was limit the quantity. And I will tell you now that there is lead in this paint. There are microgram quantities of lead in this paint. So it's not a question of is it lead-free, it's what is the level. You all know this. There's no such thing as lead-free, it's where's the analytical. So be very careful with that phrase. Some other dates in the 70s, of course, this is where everybody got into the act, including OSHA, with its very novel medical removal provision for lead in 1979. But let me just say that the OSHA lead regulations were bitterly battled in 78 to 83, so it took a long time for this material to eventually, for these regulations to eventually be put in place. Going back to lead and gas for a second, that it was phased out from 1979 to about 1985, slowly being totally phased out. We don't have lead in gasoline anymore. And this was due to its interaction with the platinum in the catalytic converter. And that we all see this slide, this is a very famous slide of saying the benefits of removing sort of lead. What do we have here? We have average blood lead levels and lead in gasoline. So sort of two representations of the downward use of lead in gasoline versus the matching up with blood leads. But you should know that history sort of strongly suggests that lead was banned in gasoline because of catalytic converters and not because it was a great public health idea. We'd love to take credit for that. But by and large, most of the force, industry wouldn't let it, I don't, it's my personal belief in 1979, they wouldn't have let us do that. You know, you would have had to really show a concrete epidemiological. So I think industry gave in because lead was on the attack. But eventually it was an engineering movement. Despite that, we should take full credit for these environmental gains. So there's no doubt about it that the best thing we ever did for lead poisoning was getting lead out of gasoline. But we didn't do it. As far as I'm sorry to look at the history of public health, we were not really the prime movers. Definitely as it was being attacked, it was part of that. It's still happening, and we have many cases. I'm called on many cases for some of these materials. So there is sporadic lead poisoning. But by and large, lead in paint has been attacked, and I shouldn't say cured, but I feel we're in control of it. I mean, we don't have situations like this in New York City public housing anymore. Items like this, most homeowners just going to a hardware store know that this is not good, that may have lead. So the awareness is high enough, and the regulations. We do have major problems on bridges where we have a good deal of lead abatement going on bridges, sort of shifting, and I've talked on this in the past, shifting the environmental cost to the worker. We wrap bridges in plastic to prevent environmental damage, and workers continuously are poisoned. And I've been dragged into many, many cases, and so have my colleagues, and it's really a shame in some ways that this is happening, that the two domains can't really live together. So I just want to stop maybe with this slide. I do this in most of my presentations, that we have this sort of continuum of where do we want to intervene. And, of course, we're treating lead-damaged kids. Well, that's very old. That's been there, done that. We have medication. And we're at the point here where we're stopping the release into the environment and stopping products made with lead. And a good example of that is lead toys from China. That the standard we had was too high, and they weren't even following that. Despite the fact that there are no lead-poisoned children from Chinese toys. There are none. That have been. All this is prevention. There's not sort of an epidemic of those cases. And I'm tied into sort of the consumer products on this, and I always ask all my colleagues in the legal profession what's going on with lead paint in toys, because most of this is embedded in the plastic and not on the surface where it's easily released. But despite that, it's still, we have to do that, where we find products that have a high risk of exposure, stop it. We don't need the body count to act on. And we see this with asbestos. We see this with many of our toxicants, that we're not waiting for things, we're not waiting for that epidemiological evidence to move forward. So with that, I believe that's it. I tried to speed it up as fast as I can. Thank you very much.